Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things and welcome to another video. Today I'm going to be carrying on in my discussion videos for my ongoing Courage read-along of Anthony Powell's series A Dance with the Music of Time, and today I'm going to be talking about the 11th book in the series, Temporary Kings. So we're getting close to the end, the 11th book. In February we will be reading the final book in the series. It's been quite a long reading slash rereading experience for me. So I'm gonna go, as I always do, quickly through the plot to then talk about some of the things I enjoyed in this book, some of the important characters, and then some of the important themes. So what happens in Temporary Kings? Temporary Kings starts in the late 1950s, about 10 years after the previous book ended, so we have quite a big jump. And in chapter 1 we start off with Nick being in Italy at a literary slash academic conference, and there he meets an American professor called Russell Gwinnett, who has an interest in Trapnell, who we encountered in the last book, and is currently writing a biography of him. We find out that at this point Trapnell has been dead for about 5 years, and that Gwinnett is interested in tracking down Pamela Wivenpool in order to find out a bit more about Trapnell from her. Pamela, we learn, is still married to Wivenpool, who is now a lord, a peer, and although every now and then she disappears on love affairs, she always seems to go back to him. However, a man has just died in Italy called Cenesal, who Pamela may or may not have been having an affair with. More on that anon. In chapter 2, Nick also encounters a man called Louis Glober, someone he actually met back in the 1920s, and we have a bit of a flashback to that time. Him and Emily Brightman, who is one of the other academics of this conference, while examining a particular building and looking at the art there, they come across Louis Glober and Pamela Wivenpool just lying on the floor looking at the ceiling. More and more guests end up accumulating in this house. Wivenpool turns up, who is also now staying in Venice, and him and Pamela have quite a loud argument about whether or not a man called Belkin is in Venice. In chapter 3, Nick meets up with Tokenhauser, who is an old family friend. He goes to his studio to have a look at his art and learns about how Tokenhauser's art has changed quite a lot in the many years that Nick has known him. They go to a gallery together, and while there they run into Louis Glober and also Ada, who is the wife of Quiggin and who we have met in the previous book. These four have lunch together and then go back to Mr. Tokenhauser's studio to look at his painting, and then Wivenpool turns up, who has gone to Tokenhouse to look for Belkin, this man who he's trying to meet. Neither Mr. Tokenhouse nor Wivenpool seem very happy that there are lots of other people there, and both of them are quite awkward about the fact that they are meeting. Later on, Nick has dinner with Gwinnett, and then afterwards they go out for coffee where they encounter Odo Stevens and his wife Rosie Monash. Pamela also turns up, much to the distress of Odo Stevens, who used to go out with her. And Nick, Pamela and Gwinnett all walk home together, and Pamela starts talking about the manuscript which she threw in the river in the previous book, saying that it was not worthy of X, but she's hoping to try and make a film of X Trapnell's last book with Louis Glober, who is a film director, and that she wants to preserve the best parts of the film which she remembers. And Gwinnett reveals to Pam that he has X Trapnell's Commonplace book, which also has part of the book's outline and some scenes from the book in it, which distresses Pamela quite a lot, I guess partly because she no longer has control of all of the kind of legacy of X's last book. Pamela and Gwinnett kind of go off together, and Nick's not entirely sure what's happening, but shortly after this Gwinnett decides to give X Trapnell's Commonplace book to Nick, partly I think in order that Pamela may not be able to get her hands on it. In chapter 4 we learn that Wivenpool has been denounced as a Stalinist and a spy for the communists, which is quite a dramatic turn of events. On another note, Bagshaw, who is now a TV personality, gives up one of his spare rooms to Gwinnett while Gwinnett is staying in London in order to research X Trapnell books, Bagshaw having also known X quite well. And while there, Bagshaw's father, while walking around one night to go to the bathroom, spots a naked woman in the hall, who is of course Pamela, who either is there having an affair with Gwinnett or is there to like pursue Gwinnett. It's never quite clear. There is a big row. Gwinnett ends up leaving the house. And later in this chapter there is a military reunion dinner where Nick meets Sonny Fairbrother, who talks again about sort of Wivenpool's difficulties and being accused of treason, and he also meets a man called Cheeseman, who we met in book 5, I want to say, during the war, who also knew Stringham. And we learn at the end of this chapter that Louis Glober, who was previously going after Pamela Wivenpool, now seems to have turned his attention to Polly DePort, the daughter of Jean, and is going to cast her in his last film, which is not going to be a film of X Trapnell's book, but is actually going to be a film of a book by St John Clarke. In chapter 5, Nick attends a kind of musical party at the house of Odo Stevens and Rosie, and while there we meet a lot of characters from previous books. Morland is there with Mrs. McClintock, which makes me happy because I love Morland. Matilda Donners, Morland's old wife, is also there, and who else should be there but the ex-husband of Matilda, Morland's ex-wife, and also the old lover of his current partner, Mrs. McClintock, Corello, who we haven't seen for a very long time, who just turns up as a substitute violinist. We also learn in this chapter that the charges against Wimmerpool has been dropped and that his name has been in some ways cleared. He also turns up at this party, partly in order to kind of put himself more out in society, to prove that he is not ashamed of everything kind of messy that has gone on in his life. We also learn that Jean and her husband, Ferez, have gone back to South America, where he is now a dictator, which is rather dramatic. Mrs. Erdley is there, Jimmy Stripling is there, Norman Chandler is there, and after Nick and his wife Isabel has gone home, rather more drama happens. Pamela seizes on Polly DuPort and Louis Glover, who are also at this party, because everyone is at this party, and Pamela, partly perhaps out of jealousy over Polly and Glover, and partly because she likes to cause a scene, confronts Polly about many things, particularly about the fact that Louis Glover keeps a pincushion full of pubic hair from women he slept with, which is weird. And then Pamela also, just to make things extra scandalous, accuses Wimmerpool in front of several people of being a voyeur and having arranged to watch her and Shenassel having sex, Shenassel being the man who died at the beginning of the book. Wimmerpool grabs Pamela by the throat, Glover hits Wimmerpool, everything goes insane. In the final chapter we learn of several deaths. Glover has died in a car accident, his last film having never been made. Pamela has killed herself, partly it seems in order to get Gwyneth to care about her, because Gwyneth seems more interested in the dead perhaps than her. And Nick also goes to visit Morland in hospital, and it becomes quite clear that he is dying too. So, let's talk about things I enjoy about this book. I have to say that this is not one of my favourite in the series, and I think it's interesting. I remember the last 3 books much less well than I remember the 9 that came before, from my first reading of them all sort of 7 years ago. And I think that's partly because for me, the last 3 books in the series, I mean I haven't read the final one, but certainly books 10 and 11, while really interesting, are just not quite as strong. I just don't love them quite as much as the early books in the series, which is I think partly why I've forgotten them. I think it's partly because some of my favourite characters like Stringham and Templar are no longer here, or you know, Uncle Giles or Barnaby, like a lot of characters who I find really interesting are dead by this point. And while I find Pamela really interesting, I don't find her quite as compelling or like likeable. I think it's because she is very dislikable. Like I find her very interesting intellectually and as a character. She's very, very curious, but I don't find her quite as fun to read about as I do someone like Stringham. But like, you know, I did really enjoy this, and there's some really powerful moments in this, but I don't love it as much as some of the earlier books in the series. However, things that I do enjoy about this book that I find really interesting. One is the kind of passage of time you see over it. This is set in the late 50s and it feels so much more modern than the last book, which is set 10 years before. You know, Bagshaw is a TV personality, there are film festivals, Louis Glover makes films, and obviously I know film has been around for quite a long time and Nick worked in kind of writing films before, but suddenly everything feels a little bit more Hollywood, a little bit more exciting. And we've moved on quite a long way from the kind of post-war world that we saw in the late 40s. And you also get such a strong sense of Nick kind of feeling that he's aging and kind of belonging to a slightly different era, and the kind of complicated dynamic between the past and the present, which I find really interesting. I also think there are some really powerful scenes in here, particularly Pamela being naked in Book's Bagshaw house when she's going after Gwyneth, and also the kind of drama after the party and Pamela's accusations towards Wimmerpool and Glover are really, really compelling. One thing I find really interesting in this book is that both of those 2 scenes, which are 2 of the most powerful scenes in this book, Nick is not actually present for, and we get it through all like reported speech, and it's quite interesting. I think it creates a different sense of distance that we get in other books, where suddenly Nick, it takes a sort of step back and he's just kind of hearing various things about these characters and relaying them. But it also makes for very interesting reading, for example, in the kind of drama after the musical party at Odo Stevens' house, because we have Nick kind of pulling together different reports, Odo's and Morland's, and how they kind of differ in terms of what people said, and you get a lot of interesting kind of exploration of narrative unreliability, which is quite interesting because one of the central kind of dynamics and relationships in this novel is between Pamela and Gwyneth. but we don't actually really know what it is, and we're always several steps removed from it, and we don't entirely know what's going on between them, and that's something I find really, really interesting. So let's talk about the interesting characters in this book. I'm going to start with Pamela, because she is really, really interesting, of course. One thing I find very interesting in Pamela that is kind of explored, especially in this book, is that Nick at one point says that she is only interested in men after they've died, that she only really loves men properly and respects men once they're dead. And you can see that in the way she talks about Charles Stringham and Peter Templar and X Trapnell. You know, Peter Templar and X Trapnell she did not treat very well in life, and she didn't care that much about in life, but once they're dead she kind of comes to idolise them, which is really, really interesting. And I think that's partly to do with Pamela's kind of love of drama and the theatrical and the tragic and the dramatic, because the idea of loving someone after they're dead is so much more tragic to her, and therefore it kind of appeals to her more. But it's interesting, I think, how it links her to Gwyneth as a character, because we learn early on in the book that Gwyneth was in love with a girl who died, and that he may or may not have kind of broken into this girl's tomb to kind of see her when she was dead. And the suggestion that both of them have a kind of unhealthy obsession with the dead is really, really interesting. Another thing I find very interesting about the kind of Pamela-Gwyneth dynamic here is that Pamela is more interested in Gwyneth, considering that he's not that interested in her, than I think we ever see her interested in anybody else. And I think that's partly because of the connection he has to Trapnell. That therefore appeals to her. And I also think it's partly because Gwyneth is not that interested in Pamela in the same way that other people are. A lot of the time it seems like Gwyneth's interest, as far as my reading of this book is, Gwyneth's interest in Pamela is to lead him to X Trapnell in some ways. Certainly, I think there are various ways of reading the Pamela-Gwyneth dynamic, whether or not you think they have some kind of actual relationship or affair, or whether you just think she is a bit obsessed with him and he's trying to get away from her, which is definitely the impression I get. She is trying to get to Gwyneth, and Gwyneth is kind of rejecting her until Pamela kills herself in order to make Gwyneth care more, because he, like her, only really cares about the dead. It's quite messed up and complicated, isn't it? But that is kind of my reading of it. Gwyneth I find a really interesting character. He is in some ways like X Trapnell. You can see how he has slightly modelled himself on this writer he idealises, but he's also quite different, and Nick talks quite a lot about what's sort of quintessentially American about him, but also the way that he isn't affected by Pamela's sort of sexuality and isn't kind of either afraid or immediately seduced by it, as a lot of other men are, I think is really, really interesting. And he also feels that he has this kind of duty to X Trapnell in a way. I've always liked the fact that he gives the commonplace book to Nick, because in my head that is because Gwyneth doesn't want Pamela to get her hands on it, and therefore kind of thinks of Nick as a safe pair of hands. A few more minor characters in this book that I do want to mention. One is Emily Brightman, just because I quite like her. She is clever and she's thoughtful and she's quite interesting, and you get a sense that there are more complicated things going on beneath the surface, as you do in many Dance the Musical Time books. So there are stories that are untold in here that you don't quite see. She seems to get on very well with Ada in the first half of this book, and then there's a bit later where they seem to have had some kind of disagreement and to no longer get on quite so well as they used to, and you get the sense of some kind of untold story there. I also wanted to mention Isabel in this book. I really like Isabel as a character, but she's not overly present in the series, which I talked about before. There are a few moments in this book where she kind of surprises other characters by being much cleverer than they intended, or having like sudden great knowledge of Cinder and Clark, for example, which I really enjoy. I also really enjoy whenever Nick and her gossip together, because you just get a sense, especially because Nick as a narrator is so like analytical of the people around him, it's really nice to get the kind of sense and idea that him and Isabel just kind of like sit and analyse people together. I also like, there's one moment in this where Odo Stevens says to Nick, "Oh, it'll be so great to see Isabel again," kind of thing, and Nick in his narration just thinks he obviously has no idea how much Isabel dislikes him, which I just think is a really, really nice moment, which makes me smile, in terms of exploring how people misjudge each other, and also because I don't like Oda Stevens that much either, so I kind of like Isabel for not liking him. I think it's worth quickly talking about Token House. He's quite an interesting figure, and in some ways reminds me a little bit of Cinder and Clark, this kind of figure who has had one movement and style of art/literature in his early life and has kind of moved and changed later and has new priorities. Someone who is very much a product of the old world but is trying to behave in the way of the new world and is trying to very much kind of go with the times and change the way they act. I also find him quite interesting in his kind of egotism and his desire for everyone to look at his paintings, his real stress and strain when Wimberpool interrupts this party of kind of people admiring his paintings. And I also quickly want to talk about Glover, who I think is quite an interesting character too, both in terms of his kind of slightly weird sexual habits that we learn about in this book, and also in the way he kind of moves his affection and his interest from Pamela to potentially Ada and then on to Polly DePort. You get the sense that he is someone who likes to gather people around him, who likes to get the feeling that he is liked, and it's interesting to see his insecurities in that way and how you can imagine that someone who likes being liked would not have a very nice time with someone like Pamela Widmerpool. So on to some of the themes in this book. One theme which cannot be ignored in this book is kind of sex and sexual perversion, I suppose. We have quite a few weird sexual habits looked at in this book, mostly the fact that Widmerpool may or may not be a voyeur, may or may not have taken pictures of his wife naked without her consent, and may or may not have watched her have sex with another man without her consent. And then we also have Louis Glober, who it's interesting too to notice how like the later books are much more open about sex than some of the earlier books, which I think is partly because the series was published over like a 20-year period, and you can kind of see the change in when it was slightly more acceptable to write about. Another theme I think is quite interesting in this book is kind of England versus America. I don't think there are very many American characters until this book, and yet in this book we have Gwyneth and Glober, two very important central characters, both of whom are American. Nick and Emily Brightman kind of analyse the different ways in which their Americanness kind of shows itself. It's quite important that they are American and they are therefore considered quite different to the English, and there is this kind of division in a way between these very different cultures and these very different ideas, although the kind of slight semi-globalization of the world in the 1950s is kind of bringing them closer together. Another two themes that are quite important in this book and are kind of tied together are art and literature. This is a book that is full of art, all of the references to the art in Venice, and obviously we have Token House, who's an artist. I have to say that as someone who doesn't know very much about art, it's one thing in a dance music time I find slightly hard to follow. I love the music references, I love the literature references, the art references slightly go over my head quite a lot, but it's definitely an interesting and important theme in here. And obviously we have literature and books and writing going on as always. Nick is still very much part of the literary world and interested in the kind of younger literary generation rising, people like Odo Stevens and Ada. Another theme I want to touch on in here is kind of the horror of war that is past. Now, war is a little bit distant at this stage, but you still get a sense of the kind of hang-ups and concerns left over from war. Part of the like most moving moments in this book I find is when at this military dinner Nick meets Cheeseman, who used to command Stringham's place, and there's a moment where Nick says to him, "Oh, you must have been a prisoner of war in Singapore as well." And there's a moment where Nick just says that like Cheeseman's eyes change, and you just get this sense of kind of horrors and great struggles and difficulty that he has had to go through. And now he's kind of okay and he's got past it, but there is this still kind of like trauma behind it. And also the way he speaks of Stringham, and he talks about how sort of well behaved and like what a good man Stringham was, is really powerful, I find too. The final theme I wanted to mention in this is that a theme so common in this series, I wonder why, the theme of time. One of my other favourite moments in this book is when Morland says that he is dying of nostalgia, because it's just such like a Morland thing to say, especially when, you know, he is unwell and he is dying at the end of this book, and because that chapter especially, when he says that at that party at Rosie and Odo's house, so many characters from previous books turn up, which I just love. That's one of the things I love so much about this series, is when other characters turn up, and I love that kind of nostalgia for a book I read 9 months ago because the characters have come back, which is really interesting. And also because you do get that sense of growing older, how time has passed, and Nick and Morland and everybody else are getting older. You know, Nick's children are sort of grown up by now, and his sons is thinking of going into the military, which is why he goes to the military dinner. Sort of everything has changed and moved on, and suddenly they're older than they used to be, and they're kind of surprised by it, and I find that really interesting and touching and just really well drawn. So I think that's all I wanted to say about Temporary Kings. In the month of February we'll be reading the final book in the series, Hearing Secret Harmonies, which I can't remember very much about, so I'm really looking forward to this one. So I think that's all to say. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.